500 years ago, he washed ashore the sole survivor of a shipwreck. And upon the skull of the man who killed his dad, he said, "I'm mad, I must eradicate piracy, injustice and cruelty, and all my sons will follow me, so evildoers will believe that this man cannot die."
G'day, this is Expand the Phantom Podcast. Our website is chroniclechamber.com and you can subscribe to our podcast via YouTube or through your favourite podcast apps. Do not forget to give us a rating on your podcast app and tell a mate about us. Today we're going to have some fun, and of course that is with a PH, and discuss playing in Lee Falk's Sandbox. Now, the concept of playing in a sandbox is about playing with someone else's creation, i.e. the Phantom.
So Lee Falk gave us a plethora of characters and settings which creators throughout the years have utilised. Of course, we got Diana, Devil, Hero, Garan, the Longo and Wambezi tribes, plus many more, without even mentioning Bangala, the Deep Woods and Skull Cave. They all go some way into adding, what we call the toys that creators can play with in the sandbox. However, today we're getting a bit more specific. Today we're discussing how creators utilise specific stories to create their own sandboxes to play in. Now, we'll be focusing mainly on Lee Falk stories, but I've got a memory of something similar happening with Tony DePaul stories, Dan.
You do, Steve. And look, I guess Tony DePaul is probably the person who's been playing in Lee Falk's Sandbox the longest and most officially, given that he's had the newspaper Sundays and dailies for the last 20 odd years. But a couple of the things that he's created as he extends on Lee Falk's Sandbox would be, for instance, the death of Diana Palmer Walker storyline from the dailies. And we've seen that has had some repercussions for Team Phantom stories, which were written at the time. And those authors needed to use those concepts at the time. And even earlier this year, Philip Madden has had a story published in Team Phantom. I don't think we've seen that in Australia yet in Frew. The story is called Kit and Katya, and that, of course, references the latest storyline that Tony DePaul has got going with Kit over in the Himalayas. So it is, I guess, a matter of the more freelance writers, for want of a better term, who are working for Team Fundament or for Frew, working with what they've been given from the newspaper stories, mostly Lee Falk, but also most recently Tony DePaul. But I guess for the purpose of this podcast, we are talking about Lee Falk's Sandbox, because he created so much of it that we love. A lot of creators tend to struggle with that, but we've got two guests on today, and anyone who's read the show notes or seen the title of the pod will know who the guests are. These guys have been doing it for 5 or more years now between them, and they are absolutely thriving on it. So thank you very much, returning guests to Expand the Phantom Podcast, Shane Foley and Matt Kyme. Welcome along, guys.
Yeah, good to be here.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, now we have had these creators on a few times. So if you want to learn about them as a creator, what makes them tick as a writer, as an artist and stuff like that, listen to those podcasts. We're not going to be asking Matt or Shane how they became a Phantom fan or a creator. We've done that previously. So if you want to have a listen to some of those past podcasts, we would recommend you going to 218, 189, 170, 167, 166, 162, and episode 120. So they have been on a few times, but we've always enjoyed them having being on this guest, because they're fans just as much as what we are, but they get to play in the sandbox. So when the Team Chronicle Chamber discussed this as a podcast, it was kind of like, it was a no-brainer asking these guys. So because we feel that you guys do it the best. Especially from an Australian point of view as well. So now, Shane, we're probably going to start off with you. Your latest story in Frew 1938 and 1939 references not one Falk story, but 3 Falk stories. So we might ask you to tell a little bit about how that story developed, and then we'll kind of fire off some questions for all of you and kind of go from there.
Okay. The story started a while back fact, I wrote this one before I wrote the one about the Golden Queen, even though I did the Golden Queen earlier. It was published earlier. The story started the same way a lot of mine do, in that I was reading the Falk story, the Fourth Son, about a phantom who was a runt. Now, a lot of you would know about that from way back. I'd never heard of it. And I'm reading this thing, and it was sort of odd. I sort of had a strange feeling about it. But after I read it, I sort of thought, well, how on earth does this work? Because if the phantom is supposed to be immortal, how can he suddenly be little? But I suppose it's the same now. The question, how can he suddenly be a female, I suppose? But I thought about how would he make it work? And I just started thinking about it. And as usual, I just start coming up with some scenarios and ideas. Like one of the things I put in the story was how this phantom decided he'd be a bit more mysterious to the tribes. You know, he stayed away so they didn't see him much. And it just started there. I love the idea of a phantom having a wife who wasn't a white European or American girl. And this lady, she was Asian, very Asian, and a bit of an Amazon. And my mind just ticks over, and I just put things together. And it's always occurred to me and stuck in my mind that, you know, how the phantom solved the mystery of the rattle. But it's obvious that previous phantoms had not. And there's a story about the veiled lady, the volcano with the big monsters in it. And it's pretty obvious the other phantoms must have known it was there, but they obviously didn't solve the mystery either. So it intrigued me to do a story where there's a phantom who tries but fails to solve one of these. And somehow they just coalesce. I thought, well, what's the Night Phantom as a runt going to do? I don't know. Maybe he can try and solve the mystery of the rattle. And beyond that, I don't know where it goes from there, but the idea of Vata being a woman who was an inspiration to other women, and then how the tiny people were involved, but the phantom didn't know it. It just springboarded from there. So, but without getting complicated, with most stories, when I read something, often a loose end inspires a little bit of thought for me, and sometimes they run away with it, and I worked with it. And I don't recall having a big problem working out how it would work. I did, and because of the monster element, that's why I decided somewhere along the way to have him writing it and doubting it himself, but saying, look, I don't know if this is true, but I got to record it. And it just came together nicely, I felt. And so does that answer your question?
Lee Falk said a lot of loose ends to pick up on too. So
Lee Falk did.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, the story, he could have tried to explain a few of the anomalies himself, but never did. So I thought, oh, well, that leaves it open for me to do it, you know. And,
absolutely.
Like I said, as I said, we were chatting earlier, one of my ideas of doing it was I really did not think that story was illustrated very well. He looked like a real, I don't know, cartoony guy. So I thought, well, I'm going to try and draw him a bit better. And I even had that comment at the end where one brother says, you're not as short as I thought you were. And he says, yeah, you don't look as tall as I thought you were, trying to minimize this runt thing.
Yeah.
You know, that's just to try and make it work. Yeah. Because it's gospel, isn't it? So it has to work.
Exactly right, Shane. I like the cut of your jib.
So, Matt, are you similar as that when you read a Lee Falk story and you notice a loose end, you just start letting your imagination go wild, and then before you know it, you've written a story and a plot? And is that how you work as well?
Yeah, look, I absolutely love hearing Shane talk about that, because I'm a massive fan of his, and it just seems like we have a similar approach. You know, as a fan, first I read the stories for enjoyment, and I've got notebooks that I take after I read comics. If there's any interesting loose ends, or if there's any characters that didn't really meet their full potential in the story, you know, I'll jot it down. I think, you know, maybe one day that could be told. And the story I'm doing at the moment is actually based on one of these sort of brainstorms, and it was based on the sudden disappearance of Fats Horgan from the story, the Singh Brotherhood, and it just seems so funny. Like now reading that story and the shift of the entire story, the plot goes from this New York gangster who's introduced in the first week or the second week, first day, yeah. And then we're also introduced to Ahmed Singh, who as an ally of Fats. We find out that the Singh Brotherhood are funding Fats, and Fats just gives up. He just says, "No, I'm done with this." And Ahmed says, "Oh, okay, we're going to deal with this ourselves." And there's never any reference to Fats anymore after that. There's just a scene where Fats and Ahmed are shown together for the first and last time, and then he's gone. And then skip forward a bit, and the exact same thing happens to Ahmed as well. He just disappears off the scene. You never hear what happened to him. But before he goes, he reveals that he's terrified of the Phantom, because of something that happened related to the Sundrick Trough. And so there's this other thing, this really interesting thing, which might have been, in Falk's plan to introduce and expand upon, but it never is. And there's another parallel with Fats and Ahmed, is that Fats is terrified of the Phantom, and to the point where he threatens his own men. He's going to plug them just for mentioning his name. So, I just thought there's such fertile ground there for a story. And then, I just sort of do what Shane does. I just start to brainstorm a bit, and some scenes pop into my head, a couple of bits of dialogue pop into my head. I write them all down and just mull over it for a couple of days, and then I start sending some ideas to my brain's trust, and then before you know it, the story just comes together.
Yeah. I was just reading on your Insta, Matt, your painted Matt Kyme method, and basically what you've just said there. So is this the story that you just had stewing for the last 35 years?
Well, like step one, isn't it? Is to read the Phantom for 35 years. That's so sorry for any youngsters getting into the game. It's not, the first step is the hardest.
But one of the good things about it is, and I suppose this is about the fertile ground stuff, a lot of Lee Falk's stuff has not been used to death. Some has, but a lot of it hasn't. Like, one of the problems I feel with Marvel stuff is that, it had all this brilliant Jack Kirby inspired stuff to start with, and he used to run from idea to idea to idea and hardly ever develop some of his most brilliant ideas. People come in after and they start to develop it. It's good, but then they develop it, and it's just done again and again and again. So you can overdo it and try and plug every hole in every plot. But with Lee Falk stuff, a lot of it isn't. He introduced a lot of stuff and then just walked away and went to something new. And I sort of think, well, some of these are really good. Like I loved Ramon, the guy sitting there with the telescope watching people do things. Now, even that story, that Wilson McCoy story, that was based on, was it the 12 Tasks or something, an older one, where he just watched people do things. And is that the same little fat guy I put in the story? This was when I was doing Scorpius.
Yeah, Prince Peep.
What's his name?
Prince Peep.
Peep.
As a Peppy.
That's right. It was the same stuff. And I think I worked out, it's virtually the same story, so I'll put them both in. But the whole idea was just to take some characters which had never been used again, and it just seems to give it a bit of gravitas or a bit of authenticity. They should come back. And I like the look of them. I don't pick guys that I think are stupid. And I'd love to use the nasty guy out of The Governor and Susie, but he's dead, so I can't.
Loose end is tied up.
Maybe I'll do a Marvel thing and resurrect him in the multiverse.
But that's one of the great things about the Phantom. Like, you talk about a rogues gallery, and you think about Batman or Superman. You can think of Lex Luthor, and how many times can you have a Joker story with Batman? But with the Phantom and Lee Falk and many other creators, it's just a different person every week or every story, and it's just ripe for creators to go in there and develop another story, just like you said.
Like, what hasn't been done more? Yeah, there was that story that European one. Was it the Legion of Skull-marked Men or something?
Yeah, mid.
Of the village.
No, probably mid to late 1990s.
Yeah.
You had Popsy from the Wharf Rats. You had the Gibbs brothers.
And the guy from Boomsby Jail
Saladin, or
yeah,
is it?
that's right.
Yeah,
And that was pretty good. Provided you don't keep bringing them back again and again and again.
Nah.
Yeah.
Don't want to overuse them.
Bring them back in a newish situation, and part of their motivation for what they're doing is already written. So
yeah. So what? Well, so what are some past characters, at the top of your head that you wouldn't mind exploring again? Are there any other characters?
Yeah, for sure. I think the Marshall sisters are some characters that I'd like to see. I know they were used quite a bit, but I still dig out those stories every now and then, and I like to pull them out of my collection and read them in the correct order, like in the chronological order, because they're such fun characters. And
So,
also
Greta or Lana, who is your favourite? So asking Betty or Veronica.
Well, I can't remember off the top of my head, but one of them, her hairdo was a bit too similar to Diana. So when they show them together, and they like I'm a massive Diana fan, but seeing Diana go crazy with those girls is one of my favorite things. When they're stuck in the cage together and they start having a fight.
Yeah. You can't really resurrect the part where the Phantom gets out and gives them a spanking, can you?
Or a kiss. Gives them both a kiss. I know like Julie's working on a story with Fifi. She's a favorite of everyone's. Like there's memorable ones like Alvar from Alvar's Game. Mine's gone blank, but the Marshall sisters popped into my head straight away. Sala, obviously, she's a favorite.
Yeah, I feel Sala's been a little bit used to death. I wouldn't mind seeing Mr. Hogg.
He was a favorite.
Yeah, the crooner. Yeah, I really enjoyed him. A bit of a mastermind. He used to sing and stuff like that.
Yeah, Bent Beak.
Bent Beak, yes.
It's interesting, isn't it? We're all talking about stories from Moore and McCoy.
Yeah.
And I must admit, I always far preferred the way McCoy, cartoonish as he was, the way he made people look. Whereas Cy Barry was a bit more, can't say photographic, but to me, his were far less convincing. If Cy Barry did a guy in a turban and he was a bad Raja or something, I never liked him as much as the way Wilson McCoy did him. I don't know. Maybe it's because Wilson McCoy was my first one, but I still really like him, and I don't like the way he doesn't get as much respect as the other guys.
Yeah, I'm with you, Shane. I think Wilson McCoy's a much underrated artist. Really,
he does the most beautiful women. Oh, he does. Like Stan Lee used to rave about the way John Romita could draw women and that sort of thing, and beautiful. But I think Wilson McCoy does the most beautiful comic women ever of anybody.
And just such clean lines, 2 or 3 pen strokes, and that's all it seems to take.
Yeah, he was actually one of his things that people don't like. He used to repeat images over and over and over. If Devil was ever caught in a trap, it was always the same pose. He twisted his head around. I suppose back then they're really limited by their clip file of stuff like dogs and that. But Diana, when I was, I think it was when I was drawing Matt's story, I think sometimes if you wanted a different pose of Diana, you think, no, he only ever drew Diana in about 3 poses. That was it. It was the same one all the time. And when he drew her like looking under her chin as if she's looking up, suddenly it looked a bit awkward because he wasn't used to doing it. It was very, very sort of limited. And, if the Phantom's been in a bit of a dogfight, how he's always leaning against a tree with one arm down when he's sweaty. Oh, it was always the same pose. Nevertheless,
you're ruining everyone's childhood here, Shane. You're ruining everyone's childhood.
Well, I'm saying despite that, I only really notice it when you start drawing it. And then, like when I was drawing doing Matt's story, the Diana and the Heartbreakers again, that it was always easier with him to find reference to rip him off.
Yeah.
Whereas Ray Moore would be much harder. You just got to get rid of all your detail with Ray Moore and that sort of stuff, you know, but it still wouldn't look like Ray Moore. And Cy Barry's almost impossible, probably. Although his other artists traced a lot too.
Well, you know, Cy Barry has a lot of repeated panels too.
Yeah, especially when the Phantom's writing in the Chronicles.
And there's particular scenes where he's holding a gun in a certain way, and there's lots when you think about it, when you look through this.
Hero, it's often the same. I wonder if that was his ghost artist doing it for him or something, or when he got tired a bit later. But despite all that stuff with Wilson McCoy, I just love it. And I think I've said before, I even like, you know how when Wilson McCoy started, it was very, very loose, his work.
Yep.
You know, once you could tell it wasn't Ray Moore anymore, it was very loose. By the end, it was, especially the Sundays, are really quite detailed. I really reckon at the start he probably had another account and couldn't suddenly drop everything just because he was the artist, and slowly he did. But I really like the loose stuff. To me, it's very atmospheric. Sometimes it's well, I like them both, but the loose stuff, like old stories like The Devil Road and that, where it's just bash, 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 quite quick, but gee, it gives an atmosphere, and I really, really like it.
One of the stories when you talk about atmosphere and you're talking about beautiful women and stuff like that, The Pampered Princess, which was one of the stories that was done in Daily and then Sunday. Then you've got when the Phantom kidnapped her and then they were walking through the woods. If you go hunt that story and the bit where he's just after he's kidnapped her and then they're walking through the woods, amazing atmosphere. Like you see the light shining through the jungle, and it's
just the Sunday version that has the detail like that, whereas the Daily one's probably a bit more rushed. Is that right?
Well, they're both detailed quite well, but you're right. The Sundays definitely had more detail, and because the panels are bigger and there's color and stuff like that. But it's just as you were talking about that, my mind gravitated towards that story.
Going back to what the original question when we started all this, you asked about characters that inspire us. I was just thinking at the moment, I sort of can't think of any. It's usually McCoy story baddies that get me. And no, it could easily be Ray Moore as well. Far more rarely is it Cy Barry, but then usually it's a story, a little bit in a story. I think, what would have happened if this, or how did that happen that wasn't addressed? And that usually inspires who you'll bring in. In the one I'm doing at the moment, I've got all sorts of characters in it, which I would not, they just fit the part. Like there's a nasty guy in one of the Cy Barry stories. His name's Nuri, N-U-R-I. He's a tribesman, and he was in, can't think of it, but I've pulled him in, and he's one of the Tessai tribe. The Tessai tribe were the ones who had the sleeping stuff in the valley in the Wilson McCoy story. Right, so I'll put the two together. He's one of them, and you'll find out why in the story. And I got Nuri because I thought it's just like what you guys said in the jungle thing about don't make up new tribes. There's a million tribes. Use one of the ones that are there. Well, I thought, I'm not going to make up. And you go, I will find a character who's been used once and is crying out to have a little part again. There you go. So
yeah, I don't know. The whole reusing tribes just, all coming up with new tribes. It's just like, come on.
How many are there?
Yeah. So did you say Nuri? N-U-R-I?
He's in one. Yeah, N-U-R-I.
That's in the Star of Benguela.
That's it. Yep.
Was he the witch doctor who had the sleeping powder?
Yeah, that. I see the dots. Yes.
That's one of that's a classic story from one. That's one of my, I guess, earliest memories. That story that I really
Isn't it
latched
the Valley of
onto.
No Return or
Fury's not
something?
the actual witch doctor, though, is he? He's just a thug, isn't he?
Well, if it's from that story, I'm still a fan.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's the same. I think it's the same story, but Fury's just a henchman.
Okay.
I think so. Otherwise, I'd muck the story up.
So I
have to
guess
refer to a certain Bible.
yeah. So I guess Matt, we'll start off with you in this question. Why is Lee Falk so important to you when it comes to writing phantom stories?
Guess it has a lot to do with your introduction. You talked about the sandbox, and he's the creator of the sandbox. So, in my opinion, Lee Falk is a genius, and also an underrated figure in the comic world. There's so much attention given to the people, like the pioneers of comics, and why is Lee Falk not mentioned in these same conversations? As well as the fact that I think his first probably decade of Phantom stories, in my opinion, are completely flawless. We see the Phantom as this heroic, noble, globe-trotting, romantic, funny character that really created the mold for all the superheroes to follow. Literally, he was the first costumed hero. So I'm actually referring to some notes here because the teacher in me made me sit down and ponder these questions a little bit. So I think as well, what impresses me about Falk is right from his first... Oh, good on you, mate. I don't feel so bad anymore. All right, his first story, so much of the important aspects of the Phantom were there straight away. And over the years, he's retconned some things and tweaked things, refined them. But the essence of the Phantom, right from the first story, even Devil, Devil makes his first appearance in the Phantom, and Diana, straight away, the first scene, Diana's in it. So what really got me about Lee Falk is he was just on an absolute golden run early on, those first few years or first decade. He was creating the mythos of the best character.
Yeah.
Shane, for you, why is Lee Falk so important?
I think it's because Lee Falk's work is the stuff I know, and I consider the European stories to be in a slightly different sandbox. And I also think it feels to me like characters they've made up, like where they've taken the Singh Brotherhood and who's the lady who...
Sandal.
Yeah, she's the Singh one. Who's the lady in the university who looks into the past and they found out all about...
Minerva Brooks?
The Brooks. Yeah. They're interesting, but I don't feel... Personally, I don't feel I have a right to use them because they belong to the European creators. And I feel like whoever created them should have the control over the character. I wouldn't dare use a character that Tony DePaul's made up because, well, mainly because he's still doing it and it's his right. I wouldn't take... I hate my memories doing this. The lady he's sprung out of jail at the moment.
Savannah,
yeah. I wouldn't do that because I don't feel I have the right to, and I think he would have every right to get annoyed if I did something with her. Whereas Lee Falk's gone, and to be honest, I try to write stories that I think Australian readers would like, and I know there's an awful lot of the Australian fan base still like the old stories being reprinted and know them quite well because they're still reprinted in the big, every three or four times a year when you get the big reprint thing. So I sort of write stories that would appeal to, I hope, to people that know the Lee Falk stuff. The other is really interesting, but I sort of feel like there's two camps that I'm working. Well, there's three, I suppose. The American ones, them, and that's us. But we're based on the old Lee Falk ones, and I don't know, because I'm sort of interested in taking Lee Falk characters that have hardly ever been used and using them as a springboard. And it feels to me like a lot of people have been enjoying that, because the European writers don't do it. They don't do it very much, do they? You know, they write the Phantom in Europe and in history in Europe. And one of you guys, Dan, I said, was the old Phantoms ever in the jungle?
Yeah, that's right. Constantly visiting France and Spain and Scandinavia.
and I find it's Lee Falk stories, I think, that when I read them, I think, oh, what happened with that? I don't tend to do that with the European ones, because if they wrap their stories up nicely, or you get the feeling they know where they're going with it. Like, there's one storyline that's never been finished as far as I know. You know the one about is it the Merovingians? This is a Minerva Brooks thing. Merovingians, is that what they're called? And it's about that 1712, it's a date. It's back with the really old Phantom. I don't think they've ever finished it. It was supposed to be a 4-part story, and there's been 2, and there's never been the 3rd and the 4th. That doesn't inspire me to say, oh, my version of that would be. Whereas often with Lee Falk stuff, I feel because I've got a right to, and I always like to write stuff that I would hope is in his ethos, sort of thing. There's a number of stories that come out of Europe. I thought, never write that. What's that Ivy College one or something about the girl tied up underneath who was consistent? You gotta be kidding me. I was surprised the Australian guys published that, to be honest. I think that's horrendous. And if you're going to have something like that, you keep it in the background and refer to it, so an adult reader knows what you're talking about and the kid doesn't. That's what I sort of think.
I think we commented very much on the same track there, Shane. When it came out, none of us were comfortable giving that to our kids to read.
Yeah.
Which really goes against what we think the Phantom is. It's a all ages comic that your 7, 8, 9-year-old kid can read as well as your 90-year-old granddad. Yeah,
I tend to think that, and I think you've got to be cleverer if you want to do really adult themes like that. You've got to be clever about it. Just like old 60s and 70s movies were. I'm not saying go back there, but if they wanted to deal with a really heavy subject, they had to allude to it in a wise way so that the adults would go, oh, I know what's really going on. Whereas the kids, it goes over their head, and it's not. And when they get older, they can suddenly twig to what's going on. I think we should respect that. And since the Phantom started as a newspaper strip for the family, I think in many ways it should stay there. You can tackle mature things without being R-rated about it.
One of the things you've said amongst all that, Shane, about the European writers, I guess, tying up their loose ends a bit more. Do you think that more modern story writing has become a bit more sophisticated, where the authors and the creators are really conscious of tying up their loose ends? Whereas for Lee Falk, we know, or the stories would say that he's, Phantom was a side project. He was more interested in the theatre and all of that sort of stuff. So perhaps he didn't worry or stress at all about, I've got to make sure that everything's tied up. He just ploughed through into the next story and kept it moving and just kept that going. So perhaps because Tony DePaul also, we praise Tony DePaul quite rightly, I think, because he knows, the loose end that he leaves 5 years ago, he's bringing back into the story next week, sort of thing. Whereas Lee Falk didn't seem to think it through that much, so he provides a lot more fodder for the sort of things that both you and Matt are doing at the moment.
You're probably exactly right. Did you want to say something there, Max? I've been talking a lot.
No, I think that's a good point, Dan. I think, I really admire the way Tony has this master plan that's years and years in the making, and it is in contrast with Falk. Falk seemed to be just having fun. Each story was its own thing. The characters you'll never see again, and there's those classic scenes at the end where the couple who've been helped will say, "Will we see you again?" And he always says, "Sure, someday," and you never do. Like even that little boy who he taught how to defend himself, to do some boxing lessons.
Yep.
Will I
Was
see
it
you again?
Cecil from the Crybaby or something?
Yeah, from was it? Yeah, the Crybaby. Yeah.
Conley was another one, wasn't he?
Sorry, which one?
Conley, wasn't there another one called Conley?
Yeah, was that the imaginary playmate?
Could have been.
There's that one. There's Fluffy was another one. No, I think it was Fluffy with Connolly.
Even the mysterious girl and the beachcomber, all these characters, the Phantom, he works with, he helps them, and then he's on his way. And I think that's sort of what I like about Falk. Those stories, they're just so innocent, And someone said a moment ago, it's family entertainment, it's newspaper stories, and like Shane, I try to keep mine family friendly, and I try to show the personality of the Phantom and have that in line with the way that the Phantom was conceived through Falk. But I guess some of the European stories, they don't really need a follow up. That's
a good way to put it, and it'd be the same with because old stories like the Phantoms one and even the old Marvel comics they were done on the fly, and often they didn't tie things up. And the biggest example of the Lee Falk is when he had that ripped page in the Hantowitch and never explained why it was ripped. Out of the comic book, and they did that years later in a novel or something, didn't they? And I've never, I don't know what that was or why, but I still find it if you, I still don't quite understand that. Writing stories without having the master plan, I understand that. You do it, bang, 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 until you reach a sort of resolution. Why you wouldn't bring back a good villain rather than having to create a new one is beyond me. I think, God, you got a good guy here. Surely that can inspire a new story, even if there's a whole lot of things left untied up in it, and that's what we're benefiting from now. But it's
There was a few occasions where Falk did come back and do another story, including someone a bad guy or a group that he had done, but the second story would never match up with the first, or he'd refer to the first story and things would be completely different.
Yeah.
So you've got returning ones. Obviously, you got the Singh Brotherhood. You got T, the terrorist.
But didn't he only use the Singh Brotherhood once, Lee Falk? Didn't he only write ever the one story with Singh Brotherhood?
Yeah, so they were referenced in other stories.
Yeah, he referred to Rama Singh, but you're right. Like
they sort of came back in the Saibari era, didn't they? But it was even spelt different or something.
Yeah. So you've got the T, which is the terrorist one. There was two of those. The Star of Bengala was another sequel story that Lee Falk. General Babubu, which let's face it was Now, if you've ever read the Avon novel version of General Babu, he's a totally different character in the Avon novel compared to the daily strip. Like you talk about the family friendly aspect of it, he's like tenfold more terrifying in the Avon novel. I recently read it a couple of probably about maybe 6 months ago or something like that, and it was just like, oh wow. It was so it's worth rereading that if you want to appreciate Babubu in a better way. You've got the the Skyband was one that did get referenced again. But apart from that,
the East and Dark,
that was probably his worst creation. And he flogged that one.
Didn't he start bringing the rope people back a few times or something, like well after the McCoy story?
Yeah.
They came back and built the treehouse, but I don't know if there was another story like where they were central characters.
Okay.
There was another. I think they redid the origin story. So with what you're talking about is the Wilson McCoy story. It was the Phantom that rescued the archaeologist and his daughter, the 21st Phantom. But then later, it was the Phantom's grandfather, the 19th Phantom, who rescued the archaeologist and a daughter. And then in one version, he actually married the archaeologist's daughter.
Which story is that?
So it will be the treehouse story, and then there would the making of the Treehorse story, and then I think it was the Captain Amazon's daughter or Captain Amazon or something like that, where I think is the reference to where the Phantom married the 19th Phantom married the archaeologist's daughter.
Oh, yeah, okay.
You know, I'll comment on something you said, Shane, as well. How you don't feel the need to do stories based on the characters created by other teams. I read through my Phantoms, I read through the Falk stories, I read through the European stuff, and I take notes on certain characters, like the Cartwright family and all these sort of characters. And I think, I could imagine writing a story about them, but then it doesn't lead to anything. I feel like it's that they've been done in a different way by other people, and there might be other stories about these characters which I haven't read, and I don't want to ruin someone else's character.
Yeah. I think mainly with me, it's probably I don't know. I think maybe Dan's point about the older ones were done in a more rough, quick way leaves openings, whereas now doesn't happen. Like it's the same with like my favourite strip, Marvel strip was always Jack Kirby's Fantastic Four, and the amount of inspiration for other stories in that is stunning. Whereas the new ones, they just seem to overplot them to death or something. So I don't know. But getting back to the Lee Falk ones, I find it interesting. I find I even work in, like, for instance, in the Witchmen story that just got published, I had the Rattle and the Little People. Well, I've always thought the Little People was, a bit of a ho-hum thing. It's getting on the fantasy element of the Phantom. But I actually really enjoyed trying to make them work, and tried to keep them a bit mysterious. So, and in no way did it negate anything that's already in the full, because he wrote he brought them back quite a number of times. But I had fun just doing that, something someone said just inspired me to think of that. It was just, I don't know. Yeah, that's probably off the target. I don't know.
No, well, actually, I've got my next question up here was, do you have a preference for the more realistic folk stories or the more fantastical ones?
No, the realistic ones.
Yeah, even though your last story just used three fantastical ones.
Yeah,
you brought Stiggy in, Shane. I'm proud of you for that.
To be honest, I really like the Phantom, who was a real brawler under the early Moore stories, and I think the Phantom of the early McCoy stories was too. Things like the Devil Road and stuff like that, where everything is down to earth, and if there's a dragon in the forest, the poor stupid natives couldn't work out it was paper mache. You go, for goodness sake. But there was always really naturalistic reason. I've never really liked the Little People. Well, that's okay. To me, the Island of Eden is a bit too much, especially now there's dinosaurs and cavemen on it. I'd probably avoid them, but I might actually find a story where I can see if I can make it work. From my standard, But no, I prefer the Phantom to be the guy who frequents the wharves and has gangsters there. And in the story I'm drawing now, I'm probably hopefully getting the nearest I'd ever have to a super villain that he fights. Got to try and avoid that, because that's Marvel stuff. You got to try and keep it down to a level, like in Queen Sansamore one, the executioner in the tent. Okay, he had a mask, but he was just an executioner. But as a kid, I just loved that, and that's one reason why Queen Sansamore ended up at the end of Scorpius. One of the four baddies that were doing it. I enjoyed bringing her back. And even though she didn't do much.
I'm of two minds with this thing, because I obviously love the earliest folk stories when everything was realistic, and the Phantom and Diana just couldn't seem to get on the same page, and there was all this jealousy about these other virtually every other guy in the story falls in love with Diana.
And the next story, every queen falls in love with the Phantom. Go on.
Yeah, so there's I don't know, I've lost count of how many people have proposed to Diana. But I look at characters like his, Steggy, and I used to hate those characters when I was a kid, and for that matter, I used to hate Kit and Heloise too when I was a kid, because I thought like the worst thing ever was reading a story as a kid, reading a story about the Phantom having a vacation on Eden with his kids. I found it so boring. But I love now that the kids are older. I love them. I love those characters. But the point I was getting to is maybe those characters like his and hers and the little people, maybe they were underutilized, or maybe Falk could have handled them differently. And I've played around with those characters in pin-up art, not so much stories, but like I've got some pictures which I've released at conventions of his like helping the Phantom break out of jail, and it's sort of scenarios. I wouldn't bother writing up a story about it, but I'm a big fan of Marvel as well. I'm a big fan of Avengers and superheroes and team ups. That's one thing that I think is missing in the Phantom, apart from in recent years where he's teamed up with the Raven and different characters like that. I could imagine the Phantom having allies, the little people, for example. He helps them out. Maybe once in a while they could help him out. They could do some reconnaissance for him. They could get him out of jail. They could bring him a key. They could slip through the bars. He's bulletproof. What a great ally he'd be, and he's loyal to the Phantom. And then you know that some people would read the story and they'd hate it. But sometimes you just remember it's just comics.
The challenge is to write the story in such a way that it helps convert the people that hate it.
Yeah.
And I did that myself with the little people. I don't hate them as much as I don't like his and that, but to put them in and keep them mysterious.
Yeah.
I must admit, I enjoy the little people probably more in your story, where they were, like, I think in the first part they were in shadow in one of the panels, and then in the second part they helped without the Phantom knowing. But I like that. But I'm not a
scene. Yeah, that was the idea. So, but it also is, to me, that's logical, because if they've been around ever since the Rattle was first left, and for some reason the story of the Rattle was not written in the Chronicles, was it? Because the Phantom has to go to Guran and ask about it, and they don't know.
They make mention LP, so it's instead of the little people, it was just went to the LP cave, or rescued the LP from.
Put the LP in my saddlebag.
Yeah.
The little people, they're in a flying saucer, aren't they? They're aliens or something.
Something like that.
Yes.
Because that's the story that I remember. I remember Prince Vlad and all that with the little people. But having, I didn't remember the Rattle. I didn't remember that Rattle story. So one of the good things I like about your stories there, fellas, is it gets you to go back and read those stories and what are these holes that you're plugging? Because the Kit 4 story, I do like the Fourth Son. I'm one of those weird people that actually like that story. And he should very well be in the bloody Bible. I really the travesty that he's not.
Yeah, I agree, Steve.
But but that was the only story that I was familiar with. I knew the little people, but I wasn't familiar with the Rattle story and the Veiled Lady. Was it the Veiled Lady? The
volcano.
I had no memory of that one.
That's why I reference it, and I hope that it's readable and makes sense to people that don't know who they are. That's my challenge, and I try to do it so it's interesting, but in not such a way that without the foreknowledge it makes no sense. So, that's the plan.
You do it sort of like an Easter egg. It'll mean more to some people than others. To some, it'll just be this great little yarn, and to other people, they think, "Oh, I get that. I know. I'm going to dig out that issue."
Is that a challenging balance to create a story that will stand alone to someone who maybe this is the first ever Phantom story they read, and yet also making meaning on such a deeper level for your Rusted On fans?
Yeah, I think every Phantom story that gets out there into the world is going to be someone's first comic. And that's a bit of a responsibility. I think. I was just thinking, it's funny. Shane and I are on together because we brought Steggy back.
Yes, we did.
but we did it in a way
Yeah, I thought it was good.
that referenced an old story.
Yeah.
And we had the town folk looking at the Phantom, and they were saying, oh, there was a time when I saw the Phantom come through the jungle on the back of a dinosaur, and the whole jungle turned out to watch it. Thousands of people watched it, because that's a direct reference to a folk story. And the way we used that was that Beatrice and Claude, I think their names, they were hearing this. And they thought, these people have gone crazy. They believe this ridiculous story. It couldn't possibly be true. And at that point, that was in the second chapter, we didn't imply whether or not that was true. It was just this crazy myth. And then, the reveal at the very end where Kit was sitting against the rock wall, and it panned out and it was Steggy. So that'll be someone's first well, a lot of people really, because Steggy hasn't been in the comic for a long time. So I'm sort of assuming that for a lot of people, that'll be their first encounter with, a dinosaur in a Phantom comic.
Well, the Jurassic Park is all the rage again, so might as well bring out some more.
At the end of the Veiled Lady story, I think, the Phantom escapes and he's got the explorers. But what I like at the end of the story is the natives who are helping him get back home have started already making the story even more legendary. They've already started making an not old wives' tale, but a fisherman's
Old
tale,
jungle
I guess.
saying.
But instead of the story being like this, they've already expanded it because the Phantom was so angry that he made the mountain explode and came out. And so you can see how these fantastic things can be blown out of proportion. Maybe it was a little lizard. No, it was a dinosaur, that sort of stuff. I think.
Yeah, that was good. Yeah.
So what are some pitfalls you must look out for when you're playing in Lee Falk's Sandbox?
Is there any quicksand in the sandbox?
This is a tough one. You see the look on both their faces. It's really.
Oh, look, I was just looking at my notes.
Well, Matt, you've got notes.
Yeah, I have got notes because I thought about this, and actually, the first thing I wrote was Steggy, and the reason for that is, some people hate Steggy. They hate anything to do with science fiction. They don't enjoy the stories from the 70s where Falk was seemingly inspired by science fiction. Another pitfall, I guess, is racial stereotypes. It's a bit of there's a lot of minefields with the Phantom. Some people have different opinions about it. There's articles that you can see which are quite scathing of the whole thing. I think it's worth listening to the Phantom podcast that Maria Lewis put out, because there's some really, really interesting stories about Falk and how he was. Some people may feel that there was racism, but it seems to me from the stories that come out of that podcast that he was certainly not a racist at all. And he made some efforts to try and change the way the Phantom was depicted. So obviously that's a pitfall. For me personally, it's getting the character right and getting all the characters right. And I feel that I made a bit of a mistake with the Phantom in my first story, and I regret making him so violent in my first story. And if you read over it again, you might think, oh, what's he talking about? He wasn't that violent. But I had a scene where the Phantom broke a chair over someone. And I look back at it now and I thought, that's really not what the Phantom would do. He's done things like that very, very rarely. But breaking a chair over someone, it was a bit much. It was an overreaction in that particular scene. I've also, you may or may not have noticed that in issue of Heloise and the Manhunt, he doesn't punch anyone. In fact, there's no violence in either of those stories. The Phantom.
That's a good point.
The Phantom defends himself in the issue of Heloise when Claude goes after him with the sword, but he tries to save him. He realizes he's a mixed up kid. Heloise never hurts anyone either. So I think the pitfalls for me are also trying to balance expectations and trying to keep everyone happy, particularly, which is impossible.
Yeah.
And you'll know what I mean, Shane.
Eh,
When you're writing a story and you're trying to keep it canonical, and you're trying to keep the fans happy, you have to make compromises, because Falk's work contains a lot of inconsistencies and contradictions. And if you run with a certain story, that might put you at odds with another story. So which one are you going to choose? Which which childhood story are you going to use? So decisions have to be made. Are you going to try and appease the majority or the super fans? I don't know. What's your take on that? Anyone? Shane?
well, I had two comments to make. It's not directly about that, but you said about the violence angle, and the other angle, I'll say the violence one first, because the whole idea that the Phantom can solve a thing by punching someone is, we've got this big thing about one punch can kill in our society, and the whole idea that ruling by force is a good thing. It might be very American because they've all got guns everywhere and everyone has a gun, and I think, we all hate that. Us Aussies look at the Americans and go, oh, for goodness sake, and yet we're writing stories about a superhero. And I think there's a bit of an anomaly here. But I think you're right. We've got to try and have the Phantom as a person of strength who doesn't just smack his way out of a problem. And actually, there's an issue with that. Do you remember it was virtually the final chapters of the Scorpius thing. It was in a giant size, and they ran the 3 chapters together. It was virtually just a Phantom story where he was chasing Prince Orc through the tunnels on the island. You remember that?
Yep.
And there was Shadow was in it, but Frew put a question mark there instead of Shadow, because this was right when King solidified their thing of saying we don't want any team up. So the Shadow was sort of in it, but virtually only in one panel. Right? And I think I've told you before, I've got a 25-page story all done, the Phantom and Sir Falcon, which ties up the other last loose end in that, and it's sitting here unpublished because we can't do it at the moment. But anyway, at the very end of that, where he's chasing Prince Orc through this tunnel thing, cave, and Prince Orc comes out and he sees his boat waiting for him. Now, if you remember, this is the last pages of Judgment Day. I had 2 endings for that. One is where Prince Orc sees the boat. The one that was published, he sees the boat, and then he runs across the beach to the boat, and the bloke waiting for the boat says, there's someone after you. And you look back, and there's the Phantom, the devil, running after him. And Orc says, shoot him, shoot him, shoot him. And then the Phantom shoots the gun out of his hand and then just whacks Prince Orc, and that's over. My other ending was Prince Orc sees the boat and goes, there it is, turns around, there's the Phantom right behind him, and Prince Orc just goes, and slumps. But one was the violent ending, one was just giving in to an overwhelming force. And I'm sort of thinking, I wish I'd gone with the gentler one, the force, not the punch, because as it is, the Phantom's punching an old guy.
Yeah.
I went with the action-filled ending, and I'm not convinced I made the right decision, because I could have got it without the punch,
And I guess with the using the old jungle sayings, the Phantom can freeze tiger's blood, or when the Phantom, and
yeah. So I try to keep the punch.
By the same token, the Phantom skull marking somebody is iconic as well. So,
and I tried to write the story in a way which showed he deserved it. And
if he doesn't do that from time to time, then that threat, that force, is meaningless, isn't it? So
it is. You've got to do something occasionally. So I ran with that one. Whether it was the right one or the wrong one, I don't know. But it's addressing Matt's point. It was an issue at that point, and I had to make a decision, and I went with one. The other thing Matt said about expectations, there was all this expectation. I wondered what people would think of the end of Strange Day of the Witchmen, because by the time that came out, people are saying, oh, you're going to solve the issue of who is the Phantom's wife, the Ninth Phantom's wife, and all this. And thinking, when I do this, I had no idea that was even an issue.
By people, I think you mean Jermayn.
I think somebody else said something somewhere. I thought, have I set this up? But and as I've told you, I think I do have a story which solves it all, but Frew are not interested in doing it at the stage. They say, let's leave things be. But
all
I
right.
wonder
So
if you could rejig that one a bit. I wonder if you could.
yeah.
You've got this story, but I know you've already drawn it. That's a shame. But if you could take elements of it,
the one with Sir Falcon.
yeah,
I had thought about replotting it so that every time the Phantom turns up in one of the panels, it's not the Phantom, it's one of the other guys I worked into a Sir Falcon story. But I'm going to sit with it and see.
Yeah.
Because, the whole idea was, you remember my very, very first story that I ever did was that little piece in Giant Size 1. And all it was meant to do was acknowledge...
Is that the Lost Chronicle?
Hey?
Is that the Chronicle story?
The Lost Chronicle is the one that explained it. That was in number 3. In number 1, all it was Diana getting a letter from Jimmy Wells about how he saw this Sir Falcon guy. So, hey, he sounds like the Phantom. It was just acknowledging that the Sir Falcon's origin is almost the same as the Phantom's, and it was a rip-off. Yeah. And that's when I was pretty disappointed, because in Giant Size 1, they did not have Sir Falcon number 1, which meant the story probably made no sense. Because, and if you read Sir Falcon number 1, you go, oh, this is just a Phantom rip-off. So my little was just explaining that, we know.
It wasn't lost on everyone.
Eh?
It wasn't lost on everyone. I got it, and these guys would have gotten it.
Well, it would be by now too, because they've reprinted so many Sir Falcons. It's pretty obvious to go back. But the Lost Chronicle was written as a response to that, because when I submitted that story, had the Phantom thinking at the end, oh, diaries, I like diaries, and Glenn Ford said, have you got another story to go with this? And he prompted me to write one. And and I just noted here, when I had a look at the history of what I've done, the Stolen Chronicle appeared in Giant Size 3, and it was in that one that I referenced the Scorpio, because the girls, the baddie was working for the Scorpio, and there was that Prince Gar or someone out of one of the very early Phantom stories, and it also referenced the guy, that prince who thought Devil was a werewolf. Remember?
Yep.
If you read the very end of that, so I was thinking, I was tying in old Lee Falk stories way back then, just to try and give them a bit of familiarity or something, a little Easter egg for people that like such things. Yeah.
Prince Gar, he was the baddie in the Himalayas adventure, wasn't he?
He was the goodie in the Himalayan adventure.
Oh yeah, he was the goodie.
Gar was the goodie, and his fiance had been kidnapped or something.
Right. I like that old story, because that was supposedly the Phantom's childhood friend.
Yes.
There's another story you could mine.
I ended up putting him in the story, and he even said, you don't visit as much. He says, oh, you're a bit out of the way. There's that comment in there somewhere. But even back then, I liked the idea of referencing some of these characters that have never been referenced again, at least as far as I knew. And just gives it a bit of depth or something, I suppose, as long as we don't overdo it.
So do you seeing user referencing Lee Falk stories so much, and do you see your work as Phantom Lore, seeing it's or no, is it just playing in the sandbox?
Yeah, listen, this is I wrote down, do I dare say yes? And then I wrote yes and no. And my rationale is, like, I want my work to be enjoyed by folk fans, but I do not see myself, like, I'm just a fan who's had an amazing opportunity. I still pinch myself. I can't believe that I've had a few Phantom stories published and that I have the opportunity to, have some more out. But I don't want to, I don't want people to think, oh yeah, look, it's gone to his head, he's arrogant. I don't. I see my stories as little standalone stories, which are floating somewhere around the sandbox. They've got the Phantom in them, but I'm not Lee Falk, and I'm not Tony DePaul, and I'm certainly no Shane Foley. I'm just some guy.
Oh, come on. I'm no Matt Kyme.
So my stories, I try and, obviously my first story, I was trying to mimic the way that maybe my first 2 stories, I was trying to mimic the certain beats of a folk story, and I was trying to mimic the style of Ray Moore, and Shane was mimicking the style of Wilson McCoy. And my latest two, you know, I've moved away from trying to recreate something that's people are familiar with, but I'm still trying to keep the Phantom and his relationship with his children and his ethics and his morality and his, you know, his intelligence, all of which was introduced by Falk. So, you know, I want my work to fit in. I want it to be seen as an extension, maybe not an extension, but I want us to see it as respectful and a tribute to what's come before.
I could probably just echo that. I don't see mine as law. I think the nearest example I just thought of then was, you know, when Robert E. Howard wrote Conan the Barbarian stories, and then in the 70s, Roy Thomas wrote the Marvel Conan comic, and he adapted the stories and filled in all the gaps between. Did an incredible job of it. I thought, I'd think it's almost my favorite 70s comic, Roy's Conan the Barbarian, particularly when illustrated by John Buscema. I thought was wonderful. And then Dark Horse got Conan, and they redid a lot of the original Robert Howard stories, but they totally ignored what Roy did and did their own continuity. The only gospel part of it was what Robert Howard had written. And I understand that. Now, to my mind, Roy's stories really hold up, and I love them. I think they're good. But we're all going to say, and he would say himself, his stories are not law. Robert Howard, the created stories, are law. With Lee Falk's Phantom, I'd say the same thing, except that if he had a small body of work, you could say it was total law. But a lot of Falk's own stuff contradicts his own stuff, and not just in an inspiring way. Sometimes it's in a bit of a dumb way. Some of the latest stories, you think, oh, but I've actually referenced one in this story I'm writing now. Towards the end, there was a story he had, and it wasn't a very good story, about a tribe that had a flower that you could smell it and you'd forget. Is that right?
Oh, the flora. It was a Sunday story.
Yeah, something like that. Well, I've actually referenced that. Now, I think it's an awful story, but I had a reason to just reference it. Just reference it. That's it. Let's acknowledge that it's there, and I like the fact that it's there. And so, Falk's good periods are law. Some of it you got to take with a grain of salt. I suppose Robert Howard with Conan, some of his Conan stories were rubbish compared to others. So, you know, but I don't consider my stuff law, by no means. I just hope, just like Matt, I hope people that like the original Phantom, and probably like a lot of the European stuff, if not all of it, like what Matt and I are doing. And I don't see many people sort of mining a bit of Lee Falk stuff and giving it a new luster and but I hope it fits, you know. I just hope they enjoy it. And so far, Frew seem to think so, because they keep buying new stories. So it must work. And I think there's been pretty good feedback from the last couple. So
I think it can depend on which era of folk you're referencing. You know, you were saying that like if you go right back to the early days, or if it's going to something like, God forbid, from the 90s, there's different law. So my latest story is a prequel to the first story. So, you know, I could ignore a lot of the stuff that came in later, but I don't think that would sit well with Phantom fans. Like for example, in the first story, the Phantom was a descendant of Christopher Standish. So do I go with Standish as a name? And it's not, the name Walker didn't come in until much later, and it wasn't even Falk that came up with the name. But Walker wasn't the family name of the Phantom. It was the Phantom's mother was the Phantom's auntie's husband's name. So Lucy and Jasper, they were the Walkers, and that story seemed to imply that the Phantom didn't even have a name. Like he turned up there in America to get his education basically as an unnamed child, and they started.
Walker first like a nickname because he was the ghost who walks. He used to say, "Walker, I'm Walker," bracket, and then a reference for the ghost who walks, as if it was a made-up name. because he's called.
And I actually really liked the idea of it being Standish to begin with, because he was standing, and then once he became the Phantom, he began walking.
He's walking.
I don't know. That's just a stupid English teacher thing of mine, I suppose. But I actually really liked that progression.
So going back to that story, you know, it seemed to be it was Lucy and Jasper Walker who called him Kip, K-I-P, because that name hadn't been used, and Kit hadn't been used either. So, you know, do I refer to my Phantom as Kit Walker, or is he Kip Walker, or is he something Standish? You know, like I know like the answer, what people will want is Kit Walker, but that doesn't really go with the origin that was established right back in the start, and it doesn't even.
It's interesting because you know how, like I said, I've got approval to do this story, which is combining the origin of the Phantom, which ran right from the beginning, and then the one with the Bandar being enslaved and that statue thing.
Yeah,
to me, the two are oil and water. I think, well, where's the deep woods come into this? Why is the Phantom? So I've written this story which combines them all, and hopefully, as much as possible, I kept what was written by Falk. The only part that I haven't is that the pygmy people are not the ones that give him his skin-tight costume. They just wear a loose loincloth. How can they do that? So I changed that. And the other bit I changed was I don't like the idea that it's the white man who taught them how to use the poison berries. Come on, they're not dumb.
Yeah.
You know, but I've got an explanation of the Standish thing.
So yeah,
I just said that Standish was his real name, but when he stowed away on ships, stowed away something like that, he used the name Walker so as not to implicate his family back home or something. So he is both. Now, I don't even know the history you're referring to, Matt, because I've obviously forgotten that if I knew it, so it might run counter to that. I don't know, but it's something like that is in this story, as if he gives both names and there's a reason for them. So
yeah. Well, this story, the story that I'm referring to, it sort of implies that Walker was never used by any Phantoms up until the current one.
Yep.
And it came in, you know, at his childhood. And it also seems to imply, well, it's not explicit, but none of the Phantoms were ever called by a first name. And then, you know, Falk has gone back and he's made all of them Walkers, and he's made them all Kits. Yeah. And so there's a strange thing too. Like, why are they all named Kit?
Well, Kit is
sometimes they're Chris too, aren't they? Or is that one? Is that a Scandinavian thing?
But Kit is an acceptable short name for Christopher. So Christopher Standish would be Kit Standish.
Yes.
I don't know whether I don't know whether that's a short
So
name.
yeah, Kip's been in two stories. There was the female Phantom. Julie also calls her brother Kip, and then in the one childhood Phantom story, there is Kip as well. So what some people have said in the past, that Kip was Diana speaking with a lisp. So that's how some people have explained it in the past.
And in the kid Phantom, he was Kit.
Yeah, Kit.
Kit Walker.
Yeah, Kip's accepted.
Well, we'll never know. We'll give it lots of explanations, and people can pick the one they like the best.
Yeah.
So we've made mention of the Bible, just trying to keep us moving on. We're probably nearing the end. Do you use the Phantom Bible? Have you used it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, frequently, and I use it in conjunction with the wiki as well. I use them both as as my reference material.
Well, the Phantom Bible referenced the wiki, like when it came to, if you want to know more about all the tribes.
Yeah,
I've recently had to pick a tribe's name, so I went through there and thought, oh, what'll I do? I'm not going to annoy Jermayn by making up a new one. The Bible says don't. So I went and used the references to find a tribe which was an accept one, and I've got it here. And thought, oh, that's good. And then I went back and looked up where they're actually used to make sure it works. So yeah, definitely. And I've read around the other things I was using too. What was it? Different. It's a good shortcut to work out some of the histories of some of the phantoms. I remember when I was going through the Ninth Phantom thing, looking at it and noticing that this story is not considered valid. I said, right, and it inspired me. But
Let's make it valid.
The 9th and the 10th and the 8th and that sort of stuff to make sure I got it right or something. Yeah.
So you've hinted at this a few times, Shane. So what is it about the Night Phantom and the Runt that you like so much, and why do you think it should be included in the Phantom Bible?
I can't say I liked it. I liked his foreign wife. I thought it was great, an Amazon woman as a wife, because I really think it's a bit like Tarzan, in that you got the white man lording it over the native people, and of course it doesn't sit well now. But I sort of think all those kids growing up in the Skull Cave, they're going to like the look of some of the dark-skinned girls running around. They're not going to always want to go to Europe to find a wife or America sort of thing. So how come the Phantom by now isn't black? You know, I sort of get it. So I love the idea that Lee Falk himself gave the Phantom at least an Asian wife. She's not a European one. I like that, and I like the fact he had a strong warrior wife to play with. But my main inspiration wasn't that I liked it at all. It was that I took it as a challenge to find out how to make it work.
Okay, so it was a challenge.
Yeah, and it sort of grew from there. And I thought, oh well, I haven't, and I thought I haven't seen any other stories with this. I didn't realise that there were lots of Ninth Phantom stories which totally ignored the fact he's supposed to be the Runt. You know, I didn't realise that the guy who married Flame was the same fella.
Yeah.
I didn't even know, because I haven't been not versed in a lot of those. And so it sort of made it more interesting in a sense. But no, it was to try and make it work. And my brain ticked over and I kept thinking of little ways where you could do something with this to soften this part, strengthen this part, and a story grew out of it. It wasn't because I liked it. I thought in many ways a lot of it was quite dumb, particularly the artwork got to me. I thought, oh, come on. I was, especially since, was it the first time it was published? It's got, I think it might be, it's got the fourth son in the front. It's got a very weak cover, but in the back is one of the Emperor Joker, what's his name? Joker stories. Junker. The Junker story is in the back of the same issue. And the artwork in the Junker one is absolutely brilliant. It's one of the top Cyberry stories ever. In the front is one of the worst in the same. So, I keep that issue out. One is to reference one and one is to look at the art in the other.
It's an amazing thing, and you're absolutely right about the art, but just to jump backwards to the first part of what you said there, the Phantom seems to be a really unique character in the sense that we've got 90-some years of stories now that as a fan group we seem to insist must have a continuity, and everything must make sense and it must all slot in. Marvel, and we've mentioned them a few times, DC is exactly the same. They've given up on that a long time ago, and people can just rehash and redo and oh, that's a different universe and whatever. It's a super challenge, isn't it, in the Phantom universe that we go, oh no, really contradict a story from the 1940s, you're wrong.
It doesn't work, does it? It's like even Marvel in the 70s, which was a long time ago now, it didn't work. They would insist that something happened and it was gospel truth. But that's just the stories with the baddies. When you look at it, the Sue Richards of the Fantastic Four in the 70s could not be the same woman that was running around in the 60s. She's a totally different person. When you get to the 80s and John Byrne took over, it doesn't work, really. You can say they met Dr. Doom back in Fantastic Four 5. Sure, but the Sue Richards, Sue Storm in Fantastic Four 5 couldn't be the same woman that's up here. And some of the Marvel comics in the 60s even had a slightly Christian worldview. By the time you get to John Byrne, there's no such thing. So things like all that change around it, but the plot points keep going. So the Phantom, it's utterly impossible that Phantom now could be the Phantom. And I really agree with Matt. I wish that Lee Falk had done it in real time and we were now seeing the fourth Phantom from when it started or something. I think that is great, but of course he didn't know that was going to happen. The Diana now can't be the Diana that was boxing on the SS Trotter in #1. It's just not. But you got to leave that aside. All I'm doing is writing stories for people that like the Phantom from the 60s back and just referencing them. And, you know, and I suppose getting back to a point earlier, I think even though I mainly reference Wilson McCoy illustrated stories, I think the Phantom I try to write is the Phantom who appeared in the first Cy Barry stories. Love that one. And I think Cy Barry himself probably didn't, because he said he liked to bring a lot of emotion into the Phantom. And I think in those early ones, he was quite stoic. He was like this iron guy, and he just stand there. He looked big compared to the way Wilson McCoy had drawn him. And I love him in The Hanter Witch and The Drummer of Timpani and stories like that, where he's just
Island of the Dogs.
Island of Dogs, that sort of stuff. Yeah, just superb. And I think that's the Phantom I draw and try to write, even though a lot of the characters and situations are coming out of earlier stories.
I've got a Shane Foley page framed, and I look at it every single day, and I walk past it every single day. And what I love about it is it's Kitten, it's Heloise and the Phantom riding on their way to the Misty Mountains, and the bottom panel is a big close up of the Phantom, and it's like Shane was just saying, it's very reminiscent of early Barry. The mask, the beautiful fat mask with the very...
It's a thin mask. He knows my style by the thin mask. That's what he says.
Oh, well, the very sharp triangles inside the eyes.
How he did it, the triangle in the white, and then the almost eyebrow shape at the top. Yeah, I love it. Really good. Yeah.
Fellas, you've been talking a lot about past stories, you know, filling in gaps in the past. Shane, any plans of using Kitten Heloise? Oh, Heloise. I fucking speak. Heloise as a future Phantom story?
I am reluctant because and I don't even use Diana much. I know they're very popular. I presume they're popular because when you did your survey thing, Matt's 2 stories were at the top, and they're using Kit and Heloise. Congratulations, Matt. That's excellent. I love Matt's take on them, but you've got Tony DePaul writing their futures now, and you've got Matt ducking back and filling in some of those teenage years before they've done that. I don't really see any room for me, because if I wrote a future Phantom story, I know that the current ones from Europe, or the one that's currently in Frew, they're like their 22nd Phantom stuff, and they're like what if type stories, aren't they? They're not saying they're valid or not. I think the idea that the Phantom's just disappeared is very clever, in that they're not pinning down what's happened to him. I suppose I could. I don't know. I've got a story coming up, a little 8-page one, and it's called Ghost Walkers, and it sort of postulates a sort of future for the Phantom. I think it's mostly, hopefully, just a little bit intriguing, but it answers nothing. If they want me to follow up on it, maybe I will. I don't know, and say, well, maybe I don't know.
So is that story you're talking about, is that featuring the 22nd Phantom, or is it a Phantom?
35th.
35th Phantom.
No idea.
What about you, Matt? Same question. Like Shane said, you've written a couple of stories there with Kit and Heloise. What about any more future Phantom?
No, my Kit and Heloise, I don't want to step on Tony DePaul's toes. And what he's doing with those characters, fantastic. And you know, I wrote those stories a little while ago, and then I've been following Tony's stories, and I've seen, you know, the twins have been split up, and I thought, you know, I'm not going to write those characters in that setting, because I don't know where he's taking it. You know, your guess is as good as mine, but I'm intrigued. So my story has jumped back a little bit, you know, as Shane said a moment ago. I hope that before too long we will be writing stories about and reading stories about the 22nd Phantom, the 22nd and 23rd. I'm not sure how it's going to go. I think it's time. As much as I love the 21st, I'm really fascinated to see what's going to happen. What's going to happen in the next 5-10 years of this franchise? Future? No, I'll leave that to the people with imaginations.
I'll be interested to see what you think of what I did.
Do you know when it's coming out?
Non-starter, you might say that was rubbish. That's fair enough. Or you might say it's good. I don't know.
Do you know when it's coming out, Shane?
I don't think it's too far away. I've had because my Crippled Jake one, which is coming up, is in the next issue, and then I don't think it's too far away because they haven't got much of a backlog of these stories.
So you make mention that Crippled Jack's in the next story. Without giving it away, could you tease it and anticipate, like make us hungry for it?
Well, I wrote it as a Sir Falcon story ages ago, and it was a follow-up to. Remember, there was a story of Sir Falcon called "Blood in Her Eyes" about the Archer, the slave girl. That's for those who read Sir Falcon stories that don't have the Phantom in them.
I think I remember that one.
And it was him at a giant size, and it was him on his way home. So it's a Phantom of the past, and I've actually drawn his costume a little bit using the updated costumes, just a little bit. But it's a little ghost story from the past. That's all it is.
So is it a standalone one part, or is there
it's an 8-page story? Yeah,
just 8 pages.
Hard to write those things. That was just a little episode, and the Ghost Walkers one is just 8 pages as well. But it sort of starts in the middle and ends in the middle, just to see if anyone's interested in that approach. Yeah. See, the next one that I'm doing now, it's 6 parts long. Both they're 6 parts long. So I find it hard to write short stories.
And this is your origin story that you told us a little bit about before.
That's one of them. I haven't started that one yet. I've started this one. The Leopard Man in it.
Oh, wow.
That's the tale of the current Phantom. And believe it or not, I've yet again got the Golden People in it. I can't believe I'm writing them. I don't even particularly think they're great either. See, the Golden People, the Golden Queen, that was written because there was this dangling thread left about what happened, and I thought, what happened? So I wrote the story. Yeah, it was one of those unfinished things, and now I've got them again. There you go. I'm using characters I don't think are very good, but I'm writing around them.
Making them good.
The little people and
the little people.
I really enjoyed that Golden Queen story. Like, you knew the ending, like, because we've seen the ending in Lee Falk's story, but it was like, I remember reading it and it's like, I know the ending and that they don't end up together, but gee, it would be good if they actually did end up together. So
we didn't go to the multiverse, so they didn't.
Yeah.
Well done.
Matt, you've made mention of your upcoming story. Have you got anything else in the works, or just this one for now?
Well, I've got the game, the video game.
I'm glad you mentioned it because I'm absolutely burning to ask you about this.
Sure. Yeah. So
We all are.
I'm in a pretty amazing situation at the moment. I'm writing what I think is my best story, which I'm most proud of, and I'm looking forward to that coming out.
What Matt has to say will come out in our next podcast, which will be 247A. He goes on for about 10-20 minutes and gives us a few details, which we thought will be better served as a standalone podcast. Steve and Dan, do you have any related questions to the Sandbox to Matt or Shane you want to ask before we wrap up?
No, I'm busy thinking about the game now.
Yeah, I know, that's what I'm trying to get back. So Matt doesn't say anything that he shouldn't be saying.
I've scrolled down. Yeah.
Maybe just for Shane first, and then Matt, like a comment perhaps just about Frew and the opportunity that they've given you to play in the Sandbox, and you've been playing with loose threads and having brainstorms about them, and then writing stories, creating stories, drawing stories. Frew have actually gone and published those. It must be pretty exciting to have that opportunity.
Oh, well, yeah. If I can go first, yeah, sure. I'm thrilled. I started in when 2016. So what is it?
7 years.
7 years.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. I'm sort of thrilled, and especially since at first, I was playing with Sir Falcon and all the giant size Aussie characters more than the Phantom, and I found it. I really enjoyed that, but then that sort of came to an end because of King's stuff, and I've been really thrilled with the reaction I've had, and pleased that Frew and a lot of readers seem to enjoy the take that I've got on it, and it's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Yeah, and like I said, I've got about a year's worth of stuff lined up, which has been approved to draw. So living the dream. It's fantastic, and I get on well with the guys, ring them occasionally, and had a great chat with Dudley the other day, and then get a call straight after from Glenn saying I'm sort of involved with their 75th as well, and so it's just marvelous, and a bit like Matt, I find it hard to believe that I'm being given the freedom to do what I want, because I know, and there seems to be a good reaction to it. You well know that there's a lot of people going to say, "Oh, I don't think much of that." That's fine, but enough people do like it. The sort of type of stories I do, and that sort of the type of art I do, that I'm thrilled, and they're a great bunch of guys to work for, and they actually do pay you, and I couldn't be happier at the moment.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I still can't believe it. As a kid growing up reading the Phantom and seeing that the only Australian content that I could remember seeing was a couple of stories that Jim Shepherd wrote. And I remember when I first started making independent comics, my own indie stuff, I started to think about, I wonder if the Phantom, if I could send in a pitch for a Phantom story. And I got in contact with the guy that used to do the website, The Deep Woods.
Brian
Shedden.
Yeah, and I wrote to him just out of the blue and said, "Oh, hi, I'm just wondering if anyone has ever been successful pitching a Phantom story to Frew." And he wrote back and said, "Look, it just doesn't seem like a possibility. You'd probably have more luck sending it to Moonstone or one of the other companies that has the rights to the Phantom." So I basically just gave up on the idea. I thought I'll never have the opportunity to write a Phantom story. It seems like no one does. And then I started to do my own creator-owned stuff, independent comics, and then the Frew crew changed all that around, and I saw on the back of one of their comics an ad for Phantom by Gaslight, and I thought, oh my God, I can't believe it. Like, this is, to me, that was like a monumental shift, that Frew were actually starting to look towards Australian talent. I remember my jaw dropped, and that it was Sean Paulus. And at the time, I didn't know who Chris Sequeira was. I just thought, oh, these guys, they've done the impossible. And then finding out that Glenn Ford, who was my favourite cover artist by a country mile, when I was a kid, he'd taken over the company. So my first comic, I was invited to submit a script, and I was asked to please do a prequel to any existing story. And then when that was received well by the fans, I was contacted and said, can you do another prequel kind of story? The third and fourth story were unsolicited. I basically I had these ideas and I sent them in, and I didn't really wait for the green light. I just went ahead and did them, and I found that's been like the key to my success. Like, don't wait to be asked. Just go ahead and do it. So yeah, issue of Heloise and Manhunt. I wrote at the same time, sent them both in, and then one after another. Actually, obviously, Shane illustrated one, and while he was illustrating that, I was working on the Manhunt. And yeah, and the latest one as well. I just pitched this idea. I sent it to Dudley and said, "What do you think about this?" And he said, "Yeah, seems great. Write it up, and we'll send it to Kings." And yeah, they got the green light. They liked the story. There were no suggested edits on this one, which was a first for me, because there's always been at least. I mean, the amount of things I had to change in the first story, the list was unbelievable. But I think based on the how well received Manhunt was with that style of art that no one had seen me do before.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Really?
Kings. Oh, thanks. Yeah, Kings. Kings know what I can do now as far as art. That I'm not just going to be mimicking Roy Moore. I've got my own direction. Yeah, I'm very, very thrilled. I'm very grateful for the opportunities. I don't enjoy the same sort of relationship, the close relationship that Shane has with them. I write to them. It's very sort of businessy, but it's working, and I'm very happy.
Awesome. Now, last question. Anyone going to Sydney Supernova for 2023? Yep.
Yeah, I'll be there.
So are you a guest? Last year?
Yes. Yeah, I'm going to be a guest at Melbourne and Sydney. And yeah, I'll just have to try and wrangle myself a ticket for the dinner.
So that was your last year. That was your first dinner. Is that right?
First, yeah. And what a night that was. That was unreal. I hadn't been in a room with people that knew as much or more about the Phantom as I do, and if I was overwhelmed. Like everyone you spoke to, the husbands, the wives, they were all Phantom fanatics. There didn't seem like anyone was just dragged along and they hated it. Everyone was so into it. It's like finding your tribe finally.
I'm pretty sure I'm going. I certainly hope so. Plans are to do it. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Shane and Matt, for joining us. Thank you for letting us play in the sandbox with you as we had this discussion. As I always tell my kids, make sure you take your shoes off and sweep, and make sure that you're not bringing any sand inside the house. If you have enjoyed that and you want to hear about some other creators talking about the sandbox concept, we have discussed this in the past with Paul Mason and Jeff Weigel. So we recommend giving their podcast a bit of a re-listen for some other perspectives on the topic as well. Paul Mason has spent a lot of time on it as well. So, and I remember Andrew Constant talking about it in a podcast as well. So, well, I hope you fans enjoyed that. We would love to hear your thoughts, your feedback, and your opinions. You can leave all that on the social media platforms or over at our YouTube channel as well. Shane, you've been following us on YouTube as well, I see.
Have I? Oh, I made a comment. Yeah.
So we thank you for that. Our website is chroniclechamber.com, and you can contact us at chroniclechamber@gmail.com. Patreons get early access to podcasts, extra podcast videos, and early access to sneak peeks of the new video game, which Matt talked about as well. So if you're thinking about joining or you're on the fence and you want to see some early access, please jump on, support us. It's greatly appreciated. You can subscribe to us via YouTube or through your favorite podcast apps, including iTunes and Spotify. From myself, thank you guys. Have a great day. Stay safe and happy dancing.
Thanks very much, everybody. Happy Phantoming.
Thank you for your time. Happy Phantoming, and a shout out to Lawrence, who I bumped into at the comic shop the other day buying his fortnightly Phantom toy. Happy Phantoming, everyone.
And not die. The ghost who walks. Enemies he swear the phantom's always there, but you won't mind the phantom. He fights